Hi, I'm Andy Yost, an attorney with the Children's Bureau's Capacity Building Center for Courts, and I'm here with my colleague, Dr. Dana Weiner, Child Welfare Policy Researcher at Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago. And we're here today to introduce to you the topic of being an everyday scientist. These are two words that you might not hear that often in your normal day-to-day life, everyday and scientist. Normally when we think about science or scientists, they're sort of austere folks, maybe not the kind of person you want to have at a Christmas party. They're often some laboratory together, dressed in stark white outfits, and they're cooking up very kind of closed system experiments that give us interesting insights but are maybe hard to replicate in the quote-unquote real world. What we'd like to talk to you today about is the idea of being an everyday scientist. That is, bringing the scientific method out of the laboratory and into our professional environment. To get a sense of what that actually means, being an everyday scientist, we're going to hear from Dr. Dana Weiner.
So we think an everyday scientist is someone who is naturally curious about who they're serving, what that population needs, what interventions might be helpful, and why those things might work or not work. We also think an everyday scientist is resourceful and creative in thinking about what data and information and methods might be available to them to answer some of those questions. And third, we think everyday scientists are experimentally minded, willing to take risks and test theories and possibly learn some unexpected things.
So the person that you just described, to me, sounds like a pretty intelligent person. And in some ways, it might even sound intimidating to say, oh, I need to cultivate inquiry inside myself. But as I listen to you talk, what I actually think I heard you say is we do this just in our normal lives. So for example, let's say I'm gardening and I have some tomato plants that just won't grow, or the tomatoes are green but they won't turn red. The everyday scientist in me says, well, why aren't they turning red, right? What's the problem that I have in front of me? And then I start to hypothesize ideas about why they might not be turning red. Maybe they're getting too much water. Maybe they're getting too little water. Maybe there's some bugs that are eating them before they have a chance to turn red. The point is that I have a number of theories about what might actually be causing the problem. Those are the first couple steps in a scientific method. Third, I might say to myself, well, I'm going to do something about it, right? I'm going to spray, I won't actually, my tomatoes are going to be delicious, but someone might spray pesticides on their tomatoes, or they might water them more, water them less. In other words, they have an intervention and they see whether or not what they do actually affects the change that they want. And then of course they watch to see whether or not the tomatoes actually turn red. So there's this kind of evaluation of whether or not your intervention actually worked.
Exactly. So if this sounds good or interesting, how can people become everyday scientists? And we've talked a lot about this and how people might kind of evolve to be everyday scientists. So some of the things we've talked about are this idea of cultivating inquiry, thinking in terms of questions and articulating those questions and making them explicit so that you can go about answering them. So developing questions that can be answered using data and evidence, identifying reliable and valid data sources that can be put to answering those questions, and also understanding the potential action implications of what you might learn. So one of the questions we often pose as researchers is, what would you do if you knew? Some of the questions we have are just for curiosity's sake, but in our systems we really care about the questions that have implications for action.
So we've painted a picture for you of the austere scientist in a laboratory and also kind of the mundane scientist in their backyard garden. And what I'm hearing you describe is sort of a professional space in between those two things. So there is a way to be a bit more rigorous than the everyday gardener, but maybe a little less rigorous than the professional scientist. So what might that look like in a professional context? Let's imagine, just for the sake of the conversation, that you're an attorney, that you're a children's attorney. And you have concerns that in your jurisdiction, or maybe even just in your own courtroom, the voices of children are not being heard. What would you do as an everyday scientist to evaluate whether or not that's a problem and then do something about that problem? Well, the first thing that you'd want to do is decide whether or not the data lines up with the problem that you think is actually going on. And that doesn't have to be anything highly technical or sophisticated. Just get out a piece of paper, a tally sheet. Every time you go into court, write down the day that you're in court and whether or not your child client was present or a child client was present. And if they were, whether or not the judge asked them what they thought, whether or not their voice was heard. And pretty soon what you'll see is that you have a rough and ready set of data that you can use to determine whether or not your theory actually lines up with what's happening in practice. Now let's imagine that it is the case that children's voices are not being heard in your jurisdiction or in your particular courtroom. What's the everyday scientist do next? Well, they come up with an intervention. They come up with some idea or some strategy that they might implement to affect the change that they want. So in this case, you could do a couple of things. You could either make sure that each time you come to court, you're prepared to articulate what the child's client wishes are, or you could actually bring the kid to court if it's appropriate. And then watch and see what happens. This is the next step in the everyday scientific method. Watch and see what happens. Does the judge address the child client? Does the judge make different decisions based on the fact that the child client was there? How do the other parties' behavior change? So the idea is that you watch to see whether or not any change actually happens as a result of your intervention. And of course, whether it does or doesn't is going to matter, and you can adapt or tinker with your intervention to try to get the change that you want. But that's just an example of kind of being in between the rigorous sense of science that we normally think of and maybe the looser sense of science that we were thinking of as gardeners.
Absolutely. And what Andy's just described is a plan, do, study, act cycle, which is a small test of change that you can incorporate into your everyday work or everyday life. It involves the third thing that we think you need to do to become an everyday scientist, which is to have a hearty interaction with data and evidence. And that means both consuming data and evidence, but also producing data and evidence responsibly. The other thing that this interaction involves is collaborating on interpreting what you learn. So we're not talking about just sitting at our desks looking at data and trying to understand it ourselves, but rather working with the people we really think are the experts, frontline staff, system stakeholders, to understand what the research evidence is telling us. So inherent in this hearty interaction with data and everything we're describing really are some challenges that you're likely to face. So we felt like it would be only fair to talk you through what we think you might expect that might be a little bit more challenging in your everyday scientist endeavor. The first of those is that you might learn some unexpected things. The data might disagree with your own beliefs, values, experience, or your understanding of the situation. And that willingness to kind of be challenged and to trust reliable and valid data and to potentially change direction based on something new that you learn is part of this process of engaging with data and evidence.
Even if the data that you have is not disagreeable, in other words, if the data does confirm what you think is the case, it may be the case that the data you have, despite its strength, isn't clean data or comprehensive data. In other words, it has gaps. Every data set is going to reveal some truth and at the same time conceal some truth. So the diligent everyday scientist is aware of this fact, and whenever they realize that there's a gap in the data that they have, you don't stop there. You just go out and collect some more data and continue to add context and sort of collateral information, supplemental information to really understand what's going on.
Absolutely. And the word that's coming to mind is patience. I think this everyday scientist thing requires a lot of patience. Also because we work in big, complicated systems. And the transformation of those systems, or even the implementation of small changes in response to the evidence that we are interpreting, can be slow and complicated and incomplete. And that's kind of another of the challenges that we've thought about in being an everyday scientist.
Yeah, good. So there's already a handful of challenges that are on the table, right? If the data disagree, if the data is incomplete, recognizing that, as you just said, that the change can come slow. Another challenge that you might run into is the difference, trying to address different kinds of challenges themselves. So for example, you often hear people talk about the difference between a technical challenge and an adaptive challenge. A technical challenge, it's not that technical. It sort of happens all the time. For example, if you can't get a document to load on your computer because you're missing a little piece of software, you just go download it, you plug it in, and all of a sudden you have a fix to your problem, right? Technical problems have technical fixes. But a lot of the problems that we deal with and that data reveal to us are adaptive challenges. Challenges that have a little more nuance, a little more subtlety, might require changes in people's behavior or attitudes as opposed to, or in addition to, a more technical fix.
And that's kind of a nice segue into our last challenge, which is that while the data may tell us who, what, where, when, how, it's much harder to have the data tell us why. And sometimes that requires approaches to research that are beyond the everyday scientist and require collaborations with researchers or more complex research designs to really get into our testing our theories of change and understanding why something worked or why it didn't work.
So then, to return to our central idea here of being an everyday scientist, it's important to keep in mind that to be an everyday scientist does not mean that you work in isolation. As Dana just said, it actually requires a community of scientific practitioners, or a community of people who are using this method that has a high level of rigor, but also has a high level of accessibility, that anyone can do it and we sort of do it already naturally in our world. So if I were you, I'd be asking myself, okay, this sounds great, now what? And my answer to you would be, go be an everyday scientist. The world itself is your laboratory. You don't need some closed off, controlled environment. Your skills and ability as an everyday scientist allow you to be an agent of change in a very powerful way. Don't underestimate the value of a tally sheet, as sort of the shorthand way of saying that. Be curious, ask questions, gather data, make observations, and then do something about it. Implement a strategy. Rally your community around a solution that you've identified based on the research and observations that you've made. And most importantly, use the results or the findings of your experimentation to create the child welfare system that you really envision.
Now we invite you to explore this idea of being an everyday scientist further. Thank you, Andy and Christine. My name is Vanessa Ambergy, and I'll be your moderator for this session. I'd like to start off by introducing Dr. Anita Barbie. Dr. Barbie is professor and distinguished university scholar at the Kent School of Social Work, University of Louisville. She has worked in the field of child welfare for the past 27 years. She served on the medically fragile team in the Jefferson County, where she worked on cases from investigation through adoption. Her focus as a child welfare researcher is on improving child welfare organizational culture, climate, processes, and practice. She aims to enhance the capacity and perceived support of the child welfare workforce so that they have the skills, cultural competency, and emotional energy to devote to the families, children, youth, and communities that we serve. Currently, she is the lead evaluator on the Children's Bureau Quality Improvement Center for Workforce Development, the QUIC-WD, which is working with 8 jurisdictions to test the impact of 8 different workforce interventions in hopes that they will lower staff turnover and improve work with families and outcomes for children.
Hi, I'm Anita Barbie, and I'm going to set the stage for today's session. We're going to talk a little bit about how to be an everyday scientist, and I want you just to think about the word scientist and what words kind of are conveyed when you hear that word. Things like curiosity, exploration, description, problem solving, finding out what works, finding out why things happen, testing out the hypotheses, disseminating your findings. So when you really think about what a scientist is and how they do their work, what we often don't think about is the fact that we were all scientists to begin with. That's how children learn, is to be curious and explore and test things out. And so you see that when they go outside, they think, I'm going to climb that tree so I can see the yard from a different perspective, or I'm going to drop this rock out of the window 10 times like Newton did, so that they can test, is gravity really a thing, or does it sometimes go up or bounce away? Or they'll, pull the flower out of the ground to see if the plant dies. So it's very important that children do this, because it's the way they learn. If they touch the hot stove, they learn next time not to do it, and so they've tested out how the world works. Now, what happens as we grow up is we become less and less like those child scientists, because schooling and parenting and other things kind of drive it out of us. For example, there's a TED Talk from Sir Ken Robinson, who talks about children's natural curiosity and how that's what fuels the world. But because we're worried about danger and we tell children not to step into a place that might be scary, or we're worried about mistakes and we punish mistakes and we put big red lines around it, then that starts to shape us to be afraid to explore and to use our natural curiosity to learn about the world. So how does this apply to child welfare, which is a very constricted environment with lots of policies and procedures and practices that we have to follow? So how can you be a natural scientist even in that environment? Well, it begins with that curiosity. Who are the families that you're seeing? You want to ask questions of how they get there. Well, how can I help them? How can we get to know each other better so that they can gain trust in me? And so you've got to have that curiosity to be able to ask the kinds of questions to get to those answers. You can also do a lot of exploration around different parts of their background or their childhood or what happened that week that might have influenced their ability to take care of their children. And so we also come with hypotheses. If you come in with one definite idea of why they're there, that they don't care about their children or they like their boyfriend more than their children, or instead of thinking, oh, it might be the fact that they don't have daycare and that's why they use their boyfriend for the babysitting rather than taking them to a center because there aren't any in their neighborhood. If we can explore those different possibilities, then we can come to a better conclusion and help that family move out of that situation so that the children can be safe. So every day we're actually making those kinds of assumptions, making those testing hypotheses, and trying not to come to conclusions too fast, and that's being a scientist. And so you're already doing it. We just want to encourage you to do it more. The final thing I'll leave with you is that in child welfare, you're also gathering data on a daily basis and entering into the system so that other people can track progress, so they can see patterns, see what works with certain kinds of families or not. So even the natural administrative data that we have can actually help us serve our families better, as well as give our reports to the higher ups, whether it be the state or the feds. And so the integrity of that data and your input and your way of doing it is very, very important. So we encourage you to continue to be curious and to discover and to continue to disseminate and get excited when you find that something works, just like children do. And so we are excited about your journey as a natural scientist. Thank you.
We just heard from Dr. Anita Barbie. Workers often already understand the importance of careful documentation with their work and with families, but it's less common that they view their work as the basis of scientific exploration. We can build curiosity and information gathering to help staff at all levels encourage system-level change. So let's talk with our panel about the notion of everyday scientists and hear from our panelists about how we as members of the child welfare workforce can contribute to systemic knowledge. I'm Vanessa Ambergee with the Capacity Building Center for States. With me, I have Elisa Lee, currently the Indian Child Welfare Administrator for Utah's Division of Child and Family Services. She also serves as the Native American Liaison for the Utah Department of Human Services. Michaela Guthrie is the Program Executive for Crossroads Foster Care and Adoption Program with Christian City Incorporated in Atlanta, Georgia. It's a program she developed and launched. As a former foster youth and licensed professional social worker, Michaela has been involved in various panels and trainings on topics in child welfare. Jennifer Benefil is an implementation specialist with the Capacity Building Center for States. Jennifer has 14 years of experience in child welfare. She started her work in child welfare as a frontline worker, gaining knowledge and understanding of the complex issues impacting families served by the child welfare system, and has served multiple leadership positions within the state of Oklahoma. We'd like to hear from each of you, so let's start with our first question. What would you say is the role of a frontline worker in building knowledge about which practices are and are not working? Michaela?
That's a great question, Vanessa. As child welfare professionals, it's our job to support our clients, our children, youth, families, all those things. And so times where I think that would be very important is when we're advocating in court. We can't advocate well for our clients if we don't know what's worked for them, what hasn't worked, and what needs to be improved on. Another example would be just ensuring that our client is getting the proper services so that they are improving in whatever capacity that they needed to. We need to know what's worked prior, what hasn't worked. And then another example I thought about was in terms of reunification. So oftentimes that's our goal, to reunify the child with their birth family. And so equipping the birth parents, for example, for when that child comes back home. So if we know beforehand what services have worked, what therapies worked, or hasn't worked, then we can ensure that those services are put in place when that child goes back home and things can remain stable. And so even thinking about, if caseworkers are aware of this, in their individual cases, it helps set everyone up for success. It helps foster parents feel supported if they're getting the right services, so it helps retain them. It helps children, it helps limit traumatic experiences for children, because if they're being retained in a foster home, then they're moving less often. Or it also helps them in terms of, if this has worked for this particular client, they can think about using that same technique in the future. And so lots of different ways like that. But Jennifer, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think when you're thinking about how to build knowledge about practices that are and aren't working, and when you're thinking about a frontline worker's role, they need to have an understanding of a child's course or a family's course throughout the life of a case. So whether that's when they first come in and are known to a system through prevention services, and then kind of how that progresses to an exit to adoption, really understanding that and understanding their role within that framework. So if you're an intake worker, an FCS worker, or a permanency worker, taking time to understand the system overall so that you can be mindful and planful of your work and how it impacts the overall system. I think also, I know frontline workers are busy, but taking time to understand some of the big plans that your agency might have. So whether if you're involved in a PIP, I think a lot of states are, their performance improvement plans, or 5-year strategic plans, or improvement plans you might have because of litigation, taking time to read through those and understand some of the strategies that your state's implementing and how your work can impact that. So like your direct work with the family, how you're having an impact on improving timely permanency exits within 12 months, if that's something that your agency is working on. Also, thinking through your work with families and thinking about how you make changes to the way that you engage them, changes to the way that you're sharing information with your peers, so that it's not just about what you're learning, not just about what you're implementing, but what that system together is implementing, so that you can have a bigger impact, right? So if I'm sharing with you, hey, I have this great strategy, it worked, it was amazing, I saw these amazing outcomes, then we can share, and together we can have a bigger impact. So I think those are a couple of things that I would recommend.
And I love that idea that you talked about impact, because in my work in Indian child welfare, sometimes we have the frontline worker think as soon as they get an ICWA, that's what we call an ICWA case, I hear this sigh like, oh my goodness, I have an ICWA case. And I'm like, no, don't think that way at all. But I think the biggest problem is the frontline workers really struggle with understanding not only the act, but basic things within the act, such as how to define an Indian child. It seems like a simple thing, but it really isn't. The frontline worker has to understand a federal trust relationship, tribal governments. They have to understand what is a federally recognized tribe, what is membership, who do you contact in the tribe. So there's all of these things that they're unfamiliar with in most cases. And so we spend a lot of time educating our frontline staff, and getting feedback from them is critical, because they may not have a lot of ICWA cases, but they've got to have that basic understanding of, who is an Indian child and what are my next steps. Some of the feedback that we received from our new employees was that they wanted the ICWA information to be very concise. Give them a tool that they can use and guide themselves throughout an ICWA case. And so even though we really do focus on the history of the Indian Child Welfare Act and why we have it, we focus a lot of our efforts on giving the tools to that frontline worker and educating them so that they can familiarize themselves not only with the Indian Child Welfare Act, but in working specifically with tribal governments.
Yeah, I can see how when working with tribes, workers need institutional support in order to develop those ongoing relationships that are so essential in the success of those cases.
Absolutely.
And Jennifer, your point about helping workers to see their part in a larger context is so essential in their developing understanding of the role. It allows them to do what Michaela referred to. It empowers them to assess their needs and the families and children they're working with as they move from that conflict to resolution across the trajectory of the case. We have another question we're hoping to respond to today. How can the work of frontline staff encourage system-level change?
That's a great question, Vanessa. I'll start. You know, as child welfare professionals, especially on the front line, we learn to be great advocates. You know, we use the data, the observations, and evidence that we have on our case to advocate. And so I think we, as frontline staff, can use those skills that we have developed that way to advocate for our clients and for future clients with our supervisors and others in leadership that can really implement, you know, that system level change. And another way I think that we can really help implement change is to research. And what I mean by that is, you know, and you kind of touched on this a little bit, Jennifer, but when it comes to any issues or concerns that we're having, we can look to our peers or look to people in other nonprofits or other agencies, other counties, and say, what are you doing that's working well? Do you have the same issue? You know, how have you overcome this? That kind of thing, and be able to bring that back to your leadership. You know, bringing a solution to a problem is always helpful and can help implement change a lot quicker. And so I think that's another great way. And then, you know, one of the biggest things is just reporting on what you've learned from your clients. So what your child or your family has said is an issue for them or a need, and being able to report that to your supervisor or those in leadership. You know, it's hard to argue that something's going well when, you know, all your clients say that it's not. So I think that that's a simple way that we could do that. I know that you have a lot to offer here. What do you think?
Yeah, so I think those are good points. And I think I'm going to build just a little bit on what you were talking about regarding communication and how we really share feedback about what is and isn't working. Because I think when you think about how frontline staff can encourage system level change, it's really, you know, them being able to communicate on the ground the work that they're doing, the improvement efforts that they're implementing, and be able to have that communication back up so that that information can be used to make changes or, you know, micro adjustments along the way to what the system in general is doing. So I think one specific example of that I would encourage frontline staff and, you know, the people joining us today virtually to do is think about the formalized mechanisms that your agency has in place already to provide feedback. And some of them, you know, we get a survey. I know when I was a frontline worker, I'd get a survey and I'm like, oh, I don't really have time for this. But if you take time to provide good quality information through mechanisms that your agency already has in place, like surveys, then that information can be used to impact system level change, right? Because they're not just asking because it's fun to spend a lot of time developing surveys, right? It's because they want their specific information that the agency is looking to gather, and they want to use that in decision making. I think also if your agency has like email links, kind of like Ask Ed, where you can drop in your feedback, sometimes listening sessions or focus groups. And sometimes, you know, we huff and we're like, oh, another focus group, another listening session. But that's really your opportunity to provide feedback about what is and isn't working, and to speak, you know, change into the system. So making sure to be thoughtful about the information that you're sharing and to really take advantage of it, I think I would say is really important, and one way that you can encourage system level change. I think also if your agency doesn't have a formalized mechanism for feedback, don't be afraid to go out and develop your own, right? So email your supervisor, have a conversation with your supervisor, with your district director, regional manager, even your child welfare director. And I'll say, when I was a worker, many times I was sending emails to my child welfare director saying, hey, so I read this, you know, we called it a pinnacle plan, but I read this improvement plan, and these are some things that I'm seeing that are working, but these are some questions that I have, and I don't really see the work that we're doing addressing this. And just send the information. They really want it, and usually they take it well, and you never know, it might have a really big impact on some changes that the agency or, you know, your system's making. The other thing I would say is PBR, I call it PBR. be purposeful, be brave, and be reflective in your work, right? So be really purposeful in what you're doing and in the information that you're sharing, the way that you're capturing that information and thinking about it. And then be brave. Don't be afraid to share it. Don't be afraid to make your own feedback mechanism, or go directly to the child welfare director if you think it's that important. And then just continue to be reflective. So, and even just thinking about, so maybe you've given feedback and it hasn't really been taken or used, think about a different way that you could approach giving that feedback. So yeah, those are a couple of things I think that come to mind. I'm sure there are others.
Well, I think feedback is vitally important, and when working with the frontline staff and with our ICWA cases, I think some of the biggest challenges for us is, how do we be compliant with a federal law? You know, most of us are familiar with state law and, you know, our internal processes, but becoming aware of exactly what does this statute say, this federal law, and accepting that. Because I sometimes I hear a lot of pushback, like, well, this is, you know, this is what we do in our state, you know, and so I really have to take a step back and educate our frontline staff about federal law is important too, right? We want to follow that. And why is because we want to be compliant. And the biggest issue that we have with our Native children today is that they are overrepresented in our child welfare systems. And the best way that we can combat that is through our frontline workers implementing ICWA from the very beginning and being compliant to as much as possible. And a lot of it is on us as the agency to do that education. And a lot of it is on the frontline staff to not only embrace the law, but the spirit of the law. You know, why do we have it? Because kids were disproportionately removed from their homes. And we want to change that because we care about all the kids in our state. And so sometimes we have to kind of reframe things, because frontline staff workers have often told me, well, why do we have this special law for Indian kids and we don't have it for anyone else, you know? And that's not a 2-minute conversation. You know, it's a lot of history, it's a lot of understanding, it's a lot of educating the frontline staff workers about tribal systems. So I think that, you know, that frontline staff worker is the most critical person in ensuring that we're compliant. And they tell us, you know, they tell us the challenges that they have with the Indian Child Welfare Act. But the thing that I always want to come back to is that, you know, the Indian Child Welfare Act, the special protections that are in that act are beneficial for all kids in the state, right? The things like placing children with kinship, you know, those are goals for all of our kids in our state. So sometimes I have to reframe things for our frontline staff, but I think that they are the best advocates that we have to reducing disproportionality in our state.
Yes, and sometimes knowing the place that workers are inputting that data and the information that they're getting from their leaders, it may be reinforcing some of what they're doing, and we need to give them the support that they need in order to work with their families and learn from their families.
Absolutely.
Jennifer, I think your example of how important it is for leaders to have information and to reinforce, and that their desire for information can really drive change in a system. It really shows how that conversation needs to flow both up and down within the system. Yep, and Michaela, you're absolutely right that workers know most about the needs of families, and we need to listen to them. So panelists, do you have any examples from your system of how these questions and concepts were operationalized and what the results were from that work? Jennifer, I think you have an example about the PDSA.
Yeah, so I wanted to take a minute. I know we were asked to talk a little bit about PDSA, so Plan, Do, Study, Act. Not going to take a lot of time to kind of go over that, but just think through what that really means and what it might mean for a frontline worker to engage in PDSA, because I think sometimes we think kind of high level, what does that mean for the system or organization, but it really applies to the work that we do every day with families as well. So I'll talk briefly about that. So as a worker, just being mindful and planful. So thinking about the different initiatives that are underway, or thinking about the services that you have to help impact those. So when you're planning your approaches with families, like I think you touched on earlier, doing research about what might be the most useful given the reason of removal or given the population that you're working with. And then thinking through, so what is my approach going to be, right? So that's kind of the planning of a frontline worker. And then the doing. So you've done this time, done a little bit of research about planning your approach and what you're going to do, so then you go out and do it. Then you come back and you study it a little bit with your supervisor or with your peers. You know, like I would probably talk to Elisa or Michaela and say, so this is what I did, this is what I've seen. And then thinking about whether or not you need to apply that to other cases or whether you would make some changes to what you're doing, right? So maybe this service for this reason for removal didn't really work, so I'll try something differently next time. Or it really did work, so I'm going to spread that and I'm going to use that on other cases, or I'm going to share that with my peers and other coworkers. So that would be an example of frontline staff kind of using PDSA, high-level PDSA. So I do have an example I can share from Oklahoma. So we were working to improve outcomes for legally free teens. So of teens who were in care on their 16th birthday and were legally free, we were looking to improve the percentage that were exiting to permanency by age of 18. So when we first started work, it was about 23 to 25% of that population achieving permanency. So almost 75% of kids 16 and older were not achieving permanency by their 18th birthday. So we organized this little group, we called them Permanency Expediters. They didn't do anything, it wasn't a new contract or really a new approach to the actual work. It wasn't a change to policy. It was just thinking through how, so this group met with the youth, met with placement providers for those youth, met with the caseworkers that were assigned, service providers that were assigned, and would have conversations about what permanency meant, we saw that like 75% of those kids had, or youth had, goals of APLA. So if your goal is APLA, how are you really making efforts to achieve permanency, right? It's almost saying that it's fine to sit there until you're 18. So talking about and thinking through as a group what those barriers are. So they would go out, they would have conversations with everyone involved and assigned to those youth, think through what was already done, what they could do differently, what the barriers were, why youth were saying no, why placement providers who were committed to keeping them long term, but just weren't saying yes to becoming an adoptive placement. What were the barriers? Working through some things like we had, tools like Unpacking the No, really going through that, seeing what the barriers were, coming back every month after doing that and having a discussion with their peers and with their supervisor about what did or didn't work, and then going back and doing something differently. Talking about, hey, even something as simple as I used this database or website when I was searching for kin and I had a great outcome versus when I used this one and not so much work, so don't waste your time there, you're not going to get a lot of outcomes. Thinking through training that they might offer to staff in the office locally, come back, have a discussion, this worked, this didn't, that was just their job for a couple of years. And so seeing the outcomes that they were able to realize, they improved permanency. So from 23 to 25% achieving permanency in a 2-year time frame went to 54%, just by making intentional adjustments every month to the way that they were engaging, the way that they were thinking about permanency. It spurred some bigger system level change, like seeing that sometimes youth were saying no to permanency because they were afraid that they were going to lose out on benefits. And then having conversations about how do we change that in our system? What do we need to create or develop that shows that, hey, you still have a lot of benefits even if you achieve permanency, dispelling the myths, things like that. So the PDSA at the micro level helped them to make adjustments in their engagement on an ongoing basis, but on a higher level, it really spurred some change to the system as well.
That's great. One thing I was thinking about as you were talking was the work that we did several years ago when the Bureau of Indian Affairs came out with new regulations for how to interpret and implement the Indian Child Welfare Act. We really struggled because although we were training our own staff in how to implement those regulations in light of the Indian Child Welfare Act, we found that our other partners, our legal partners, did not have the same information. So we could arm our frontline staff with the best of information, and they would go to court, and then our AG, our Attorney General, would say, no, that's not how I understood it, or maybe the judge would say that's not how I understood it, or the guardian. And so even though we did the best effort that we could to educate them and arm them with that education, they were hitting barriers. So in partnering with our court improvement program, we took that approach where we planned, studied, we did something about it, and we acted. And what we did was we realized that we needed to train our whole state. We needed to put all of these partners together and give them scenarios and specific ICWA cases to work out. So we did that. We went throughout the whole state of Utah. We invited judges, we invited our Attorney General's office, the guardian ad litems, and our caseworkers, and we had them work through ICWA cases individually. And we found what barriers were there. So the next training we had, we would adapt that and modify it and learn from it. And the other thing we did as well is each training that we did, we invited tribal representatives to participate and be involved, so that when we had challenges or issues that came up within the training that dealt particularly with that tribe, we could have that tribe answer and be involved right then. So the training was not the same from the very beginning of the year as it was at the end of the year, because we were constantly evolving through that process. So we took the 2016 Bureau of Indian Affairs regulations, which are very difficult, very lengthy, and we had, at the end, we were able to boil down the most salient information from those regulations that our frontline staff could use. And that was a really good process of learning for us, because at the end we had this perfect training that had gone through all these different revisions, and that's basically the basis of what I use for our new employee trainings now. I took that information. So it was a really helpful process that we went through, and I think the most important part was that we engaged our partners. You know, it wasn't just this one view of the division, how the division saw it, but we were able to bring our partners along with us and educate them in that process. And what that has done for us is that has increased the amount of identification of Indian cases early on in our case. So we had struggled with having cases that later on, like we're moving to termination or adoption, and they finally realized, oh, this is an ICWA case, and they started treating it as an ICWA case later on. We didn't want that at all. We wanted to really educate our workers as to identifying those ICWA cases from the very beginning, so that we reduce delays for these particular cases in our system.
Those are wonderful examples. Another way that frontline staff, or just another important thing, is thinking about feedback and documentation and how that needs to be entered correctly and timely. And if those are not priorities for staff, then change is going to be delayed. Important things that need to take place could be delayed. And so just a simple example of a way that I've measured things in my work is creating a survey. And you mentioned this too. If we don't have a way to measure things, we can implement that. And I did that through SurveyMonkey. And if you guys aren't aware, it's typically a free, easy, quick tool. And an example of a time that I did that was sending out a survey to my foster and adoptive caregivers. And it was related to the training platform that we use. So we provide a training platform that they can sign into and type in any topic that they want to know about, and do trainings on it. And so ask questions related to how easy is this platform to use? Do you find it helpful? Do you feel like you're learning things? If we didn't provide this training platform to you, would you be able to locate trainings otherwise? And so it was important for us to know that, because if they didn't find it beneficial, if it wasn't helpful, then we're wasting a lot of money, essentially. And so had they said, no, it's not beneficial, it's terrible, then we could have changed the platform or just gotten rid of training, us providing training to them altogether. And so just a simple and effective way that, even frontline staff can measure things. Do you have anything to add to that, Jennifer?
Yeah, so I know we've talked a couple of times about surveys and just different forms of documentation. And I think I talked a little bit earlier about all of the different improvement plans that systems can have, and different initiatives and things that they can have going on. And I know probably the frontline staff joining us today, we're talking about how to improve the system and importance of documentation. I think one thing for them, and probably something that they might struggle with, is just all of the initiatives that systems have going on, right? So when you're thinking about, well, how can I really be impactful, because we're doing like 100 million things. And we always used to say in Oklahoma that if you didn't like what you were doing today, just wait a little while, because in a year or two it's going to change, because you always have new things coming down the pipeline. But so as a worker, I would always wonder, and I think this kind of goes back to what Anita said earlier in her intro, that it's important to be curious, right? And part of being curious, and if you are curious, you're like, well, why are we doing these things, right? Why are we implementing this new strategy or this new service? And why do I have to do 100 million things? So I think, can you think what my answer would be, like, about how they can have an impact on the million things that are coming down the pipe, and how frontline workers can have an impact on making the right things happen? Anybody guess? I think I would say that documentation, right? It's one of the last things that you think about doing. Documenting. I'm going to sit down and I'm going to document for a few hours, right? Mm-hmm. But documentation is key, because when the agency is thinking about how to develop these initiatives or strategies or adopt new services, looking at service providers, they're using what you're putting into the system to make those decisions. Sometimes they're, sending surveys, sometimes they're doing focus groups, but other times they're just pulling reports from what you've documented in a case. So if you really want to have an impact, document accurately, document timely, document thoroughly, really record what you're doing with the family, what services are working, and the changes that you're seeing, because there are usually multiple reviewers on what you're putting into the case, whether it's a formalized process like the CFSR that results in a PIP, or just a quality review, or your supervisor going in and seeing, hey, these are some court reports and this is what I'm seeing, or whatever the reviewer may be. They're going to go in and they're going to look at that information, and they're going to use that to make decisions, sometimes at the local office level, around workloads even. So really document. If you think you need new staff, make sure you're documenting everything in your case so that people can go in and review that and use that to make decisions.
I love that you said documentation, because that's one of the things I talk about. I mean, I preach documentation in my training, and a challenge that we had in Utah was just, I felt like we were underreporting the number of ICWA cases that we had. And that's challenging, because I meet with the tribes individually and we report our numbers out, and so it's vitally important that these numbers are consistent. And so I went in to look at our SAFE system, that's what we call it, SAFE. Yeah. In Utah, and it did seem to be a little bit confusing, and I did not have the ability to change it at that time. There was just too much infrastructure that needed to be in place. But what I was able to do was point out the two things that were most important, and trained our frontline staff on that. And I would tell their supervisors, the first time I got an ICWA case, okay, go to the person tab, make sure that this information is filled out, document what tribe this child belongs to. So I love that you bring that up. And of course, the other issue that documentation brings up for our ICWA cases is if there is an Indian home that we can find for these children or not. So if after a diligent search there is no Native American home for this child, then we can do a good cause exception. But to do that, the caseworker has to show that they have done diligent casework. And so when I open up our SAFE system, I need to see on there, what family members did they contact? What was the communication with the tribe? How extensive were these searches? And often I will hear back from some more of our challenging cases that, well, I contacted the tribe and I didn't hear back. And I have to explain to our caseworkers that we do have to show that we had diligent efforts. The burden is on us, DCFS, to do that level of work, and I need to see it. I need to see it in the computer. I need to see dates, who you talked to, what was the outcomes. And once we have that and we have fully put in all of our efforts to find a kinship family, and if those efforts are unsuccessful, then we can look at a non-native home for this child. But you know, documentation is something that I'm always looking back on. It protects us as an agency. It ensures that we're doing the quality work that we need to do for the families, and it also ensures trust with the tribe that we're able to say these are the efforts that we went to.
This is such an interesting conversation, and I'm really enjoying the coverage that you are giving to documentation as an issue in scientific exploration. And I think this really speaks to what Dr. Anita Barbie went through in her session as well, is that when you're looking at workers, they don't naturally see that connection between the information that they're having to document and what feels like paperwork, and the communication of that information up to the leadership level where decisions are being made. I think you have some more to say about that.
Yeah, a little bit. So when you were talking, it made me think when you were talking about active efforts, another impact that frontline staff can have on just the system, and another important thing about documentation. I'm going to go back to documentation, so it's because it's key.
We're okay with that.
Yeah. I think so when you're documenting in a court report, so it's not just about what you're putting into the system, but also what you're putting into information that you're sharing with partners and with stakeholders. So when you're preparing, when a frontline worker is preparing for court, making sure that the information that they're putting in those court reports or those progress reports really accurately reflect the work that they're doing. So really recording your visitation or contact with the parents, the contact and visitation that parents are having with their children, the contact between siblings, putting everything, you know, information from service providers into that court report, information around just in your contact with your clients, the change and progression in behaviors that you're seeing, or the lack of the change and progression, even though you're really doing all of these efforts to engage, so that one, that a judge can really be confident in the recommendations that you're making, and so that when you're changing a case plan goal, that they're more apt to be on board because you've provided all of this information, which when you change the case plan goal, that's going to impact a report, right, that the agency is running. And also it will help the judge be able to do findings of active efforts and reasonable efforts being made to achieve permanency. So it's not just about what you put into your technology system, but also what you put in reports that trigger changes in that technology system.
And if I could jump in here really quick, one of the things that the judges trainings that's coming out on ICWA, they're actually encouraging the judges to stop before you make an active efforts finding and ask and really diligently look through and see what efforts have provided. Are they active, thorough, timely? You know, are they tailored to the facts and circumstances of the case? So I feel like there's more emphasis on, you know, not just a checklist, but really delving into those active efforts, because that's the core of how we're going to reunite that child with their family.
Good point.
And that system structure really drives behavior also. So when a system is asking you to input information, that highlights for that worker that this is what your agency values. It communicates that value from leadership down to the worker and vice versa. If this is what they're being asked about on a daily basis, and this is the importance of supervisors as well, is to really communicate that agency vision for what's important to help their workers remember what part of that documentation, what their role is in that documentation. Workers and supervisors who are, you know, assessing and communicating with families, they're often that first into the system to collect and record information, and it is such a valuable point of entry for information and getting that accurately from families in order to make sure that we are getting everything that we need from them, that we're building the relationships with them, and that we're building trust. Not just with families, but throughout systems and with our partners, getting that information back out to partners and up to leadership in order to make the best decisions for the system. It's really a cycle of change, and everyone should feel important in that cycle of change.
You know, as you were talking, it made me think a little bit, because inherently with the Indian Child Welfare Act, sometimes we have resistance. And it's been so nice to have our leadership actually send information down to all of our staff saying ICWA is a priority. For Utah, we are supporting ICWA. And likewise with our Attorney General's office, the same thing. He was able to send out to his staff and support ICWA. So everyone knows from top level down, this is our priority. We're going to not only, practice good efforts in implementing ICWA, but we're also going to live by the spirit of the law too. So it's been nice to have that level of support.
Are there any last thoughts as we're wrapping up our discussion today?
Yeah, so if I could speak directly with everyone watching today and have kind of a one-on-one conversation with them, I think one thing that I would say is don't underestimate how important you are to the system, and don't underestimate how important your actions and behaviors are, right? Yeah. Really take time to be purposeful. Like I said earlier, be purposeful, be brave, and be reflective about your work. And I would say your agency might not always tell you this, but you're one of the most important assets they have. I would say that you're the most important asset, but I'm a little bit biased because, I spent a lot of time in supervision and I loved and, really respected my staff. But also the service providers and our partners are important. But you're the one main asset that the agency has. You're the person on the ground operationalizing all of the big change efforts and the efforts to improve outcomes. So with that, take responsibility to go forth and do good things. And I would say try to have a 360-degree impact on your system. So it's not just about, it is very important to think about your interactions with your clients and with the families that we're serving, but also thinking about how you would impact your peers and how you impact the agency higher up, because everybody has responsibility to the front line, but also all the way up, right? And as long as you're really conscious about the impact that you can have and try to have a 360-degree impact, you can do great things. And your agency needs you to do great things, for sure. And so do your families. I would say that take time to be the voice for our families, for the families and the children that we're serving, right? Because it doesn't always seem, and I'll say that they probably don't always feel like they have a voice to speak change into the system, but you can be the person who speaks change into the system for them.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. Just completely second what you said. If I could speak to everyone watching, it would be that, aside from the clients themselves, you are the expert on the case. And, your voice is so important. So feel brave and feel empowered and advocate for them, because, you are that voice for your client who, feels like they don't have a voice or really don't have a voice. And so just really important to speak up and be that voice for them.
Thank you for those thoughts. Elisa, can you add a final thought?
I just want to talk a little bit about what tribal child welfare workers could do. As an elected official of my own tribe, I'm the vice chairwoman of the Fort Independence tribe in California. I've struggled often with meeting our tribal governmental roles and balancing that with our child welfare needs. We really do not have child welfare staff dedicated, so it's always an ongoing challenge. So I would say for our tribal child welfare workers that they really work with their tribal elected leaders and convey to them the extent of the work that you're doing with the families. And in particular with the families, I think it's important that we know as tribal members that we've gone through historical trauma, intergenerational trauma, often poverty. And we have a lot of barriers that we have to work through. And so these families need our constant help. They need to be engaged. We need to be providing the services to help them heal and help our communities heal. And I think that the important thing to keep in mind too is that there's national organizations out there to give help. Child Welfare League of America has been very beneficial in providing services for tribes. And so reach out into your communities, your national organizations, and get educated as to how best to serve your community.
Bringing that information from the families all the way up to the leadership level across the spectrum can bring so much change.
Right.
And really helping workers to see their role just by being curious and asking the right questions and making sure that they value their role as keepers of information and gatherers of information as part of that process, and see it and are empowered to really communicate that up in every direction, like you said, 360 degrees. This has been a fantastic discussion. Thank you so much for my panelists today. And thank you for joining us in this session. We look forward to seeing you in the next session.